Christ, the King of the universe. That's what we celebrate today. Solemnity of Christ, King of the universe, all that is. In the beginning of the history of the Hebrews, they had no king save God alone. When they were put in bondage by the Egyptians, they were under the Pharaoh king, a cruel tyrant. When they escaped with the help of God and made it to the promised land, they didn't set up a king, they didn't have a king, but they set up judges to assist the people to be ruled by the law of God, which Moses provided. From God, of course. But after a time, they balked. And they complained to God, saying, hey, all the other nations have a king. We want one too. And God finally said, okay. And Saul became the first king. And he was petty, jealous, violent. Remember, he threw a spear at David because he was jealous. He went hunting for David because he was jealous. And David went down to his camp while he slept. And David's assistant said, hey, his spear is right here. Let me pin him to the ground. And he said, no, take the water jug at his head and let's be off. We don't have the authority to kill God's anointed. And then David called from afar saying, why is it that you are chasing me and I had the opportunity to kill you? And Saul kind of changes his tone. David, my son, is that you? I'm going to leave you alone. But Saul, he couldn't stay out of trouble. He eventually consulted a witch about his enemies, and the witch told him, you're going to be among Sheol soon. And it wasn't long after that Saul met his end. David became king. He was the Lord's anointed. He was anointed by a prophet. He did well, but he shed much blood, and he fell into adultery with Bathsheba. He did die in the good graces of God, and he is well remembered among the Jewish people. Solomon, his son, started out really well too. His father had built up all these components, all these parts and building materials for the temple, and Solomon built it. But later, Solomon married a lot of different wives that were from the pagan traditions, and he fell into what's called syncretism, mixing Judaism with these pagan religions. Then, if you look at the Bible, many after, in the line of David after Solomon, that were kings were not in the Lord's favor. They did some very foolish things. And following that, we have the Assyrian invasion, wiping out a good chunk of the Holy Land and the people that lived there. And then the Babylonians eventually invade. And if that weren't enough, the Greeks come in and try to make everyone like the Greeks. And then we come to the Romans, whom we hear about today. Pontius Pilate. He brings Jesus into the Praetorium, which is like a little courtroom, and he asks Jesus, what have you done? All right, they're the ruling, occupying power. And he says, Pontius Pilate says, are you a king? And Jesus says, I have come. He doesn't deny or confirm that. He just says, I have come to testify to the truth. And Pontius Pilate represents most of the world today, saying, what is truth? So it's not just a new thing, but I find myself, I don't even hardly watch the news anymore, because it's like I don't know what the truth is anymore when it comes to these kinds of things. I'm at a complete loss. What is truth? Jesus says, I have come to testify. This is the reason why I've come, to testify to the truth. And right after that, he goes to the cross and dies. You scratch your head, right? Christ, the King of the universe. What kind of king is this? He's not like those other kings that we talked about. He didn't build a temple. He didn't establish justice. He didn't protect the nation from invaders. I want to tell you about a queen that's somewhat unconventional that we celebrated this last week. She was only 14 years old when she became a queen. Wouldn't that be cool? You're queen, right? And you're telling your parents what to do. Hey, it's time for my foot massage. 14 years old. Her name was Elizabeth of Hungary. She lived in the 1200s. She married a man named Ludwig. I just found out that Ludwig is also a blessed in the communion of the saints. He's not in the sanctoral cycle in the Roman Missal, but he's on the calendar. And Father Shea was on to celebrate the Wednesday night Mass after our confessions, and I went in there and I said, yeah, today is the day that we celebrate St. Elizabeth of Hungary, my birth saint. And I said to him, who is your birth saint? And he said, oh, I don't have one. His birthday is September 11th. I said, no, there is a saint for every day. Even if it's not in that missal, there is a saint for every day. And we walked over to this big, thick book that we have in the sacristy, and we flipped it open to his birth saint day, and it's Ludwig, the husband of St. Elizabeth of Hungary. It's like, we're brothers, man. We're blood brothers. These two, Ludwig and Elizabeth, had 4 children. Ludwig had an expansive kingdom somewhere around Hungary, Germany, in that area. She had this great love for the poor from a very early age. And her husband, he had a tough time understanding it. He saw her one day carrying loaves of bread in the fold of her dress, and he kind of busts her, and he walks up to her and he says, what are you doing? And she just opens the fold, and roses cascade out of the dress. Does that remind you of anybody? It's a few hundred years later, and he changed his heart. He's like, no, let her do what her heart feels. And she had one of the castles converted into a hospital. The two, though very young, and in spite of the fact that the marriage was arranged, loved each other very much and had great faith in the Lord Jesus. For whatever reason, Ludwig went off on crusade. And he did not die by the sword, but he died by plague. And this is the way many people die in wars of the past. The Civil War in the United States of America, more soldiers died by dysentery than by bullets. 2 times a day after Ludwig died, Elizabeth carried on her work. 2 times a day she visited the sick in these places that she established. She begged for alms door to door. Here she is, a queen, begging for alms, and she had to ask her spiritual director if that was okay with him, and I'm sure he put up a fuss at the beginning. Door to door. Can you imagine? Who's at the door, honey? It's the queen. She wants some bread for the hungry. Unbelievable. On Good Friday of one year, she placed her hands on the bare altar. You know how we strip the altar? On the bare altar, and she swore in front of witnesses to give up all worldly display. And she established the Third Order of Franciscans, a lay order of Franciscans. She led a contemplative life of prayer, in addition to all that she did for the poor. And they said that when she would come from prayer, remember Moses? When he would come from that tent of meeting and his face was glowing? They said Elizabeth's face was glowing and light was radiating from her eyes. Can you imagine? I met a priest who encountered Fulton Sheen. This priest was from New York, and he's one of the older guys there. And we said, what was it like to meet Fulton Sheen? And he said his eyes were absolute stars blazing in the night. This is the life of Christ, and Christ radiating through us. At her death, anything else that she had that she hadn't given away to the poor, right? This is a rich woman, a queen. She gave to the poor. She said, whatever seems to be mine, to her spiritual director, after I'm gone, give it to the poor. All I ask is that you keep this one dress for my burial. And it was an old, worn-out, threadbare dress that she was buried in. And then I stop and ask myself again, every year I ask myself, what kind of king do we have in Jesus? What kind of king do we have in Jesus? Saint Elizabeth's life reflects the kind of king that we have. It reflects his kingship. Loving, self-disinterested, committed to the poor, committed to faith, self-sacrificing, prayerful, focused on the needs below and the things above. Christ was St. Elizabeth's king. And what about us? We come to this juncture, we come to the end of this particular liturgical procession every year, and we celebrate Christ the King before we begin the new church year at Advent. Christ the King of the universe. So what about us? Is Christ our King? That's the question from every homily that's preached today. Is Christ our King? Or is he only king for 1 hour a week? And something or someone else takes his place afterward? Those are the questions that we have to ask ourselves as we move into the new liturgical year. Is he our king? Either Christ is king or he is not.